All right, in this explainer, we are diving deep into a massive study published in Nature Mental Health. Now, the title itself is a mouthful, but it's super important. Blunted Positive Affect Bridges Childhood Adversity and Psychopathology. So what does that actually mean? Well, we're going to break it all down and look at why this research could be a real game changer.
For decades, scientists and clinicians have been grappling with a huge question. We've known for a long time that a tough childhood can lead to mental health struggles in adulthood. That part isn't really up for debate. But the real mystery has always been how. What's the actual mechanism? What is that bridge that connects the experiences of a child to the struggles of an adult?
So, here's our plan. First, we'll touch on what we already know about childhood adversity. Then, we'll get into the new idea this study focuses on, something called positive affect. After that, we'll dig into what they actually found, look at some of the fine details, and finally wrap up with what this means for the real world. Let's get started. Okay, so first things first, we have to start with what's already well established. It is pretty much a scientific fact at this point that adverse childhood experiences, you'll hear them called ACEs, are a huge risk factor for all sorts of mental health issues later in life. That connection is solid. It's the foundation we're building on today. Now, for a long time, the research has really focused on what adversity adds to a person. The main idea was that things like trauma and stress basically turn up the volume on negative emotions. Things like anxiety, fear, anger. And the thinking was that this big flood of negativity is what causes the mental health problems down the road. But this study asks a different question. It flips the script. Instead of looking at what's added, it investigates the other side of the coin. It asks, what if the problem isn't just about adding negativity, but about what adversity takes away? And this really gets at a huge gap in how we've been thinking about this. See, the old way of thinking focused on an increase in negative affect. Basically, the brain gets wired to be on high alert, always looking for threats. But what this study proposes is a new and just as important mechanism, a decrease in something called positive affect. This is tied to how we process rewards. So the core idea here is really powerful. Growing up in an environment full of threats doesn't just teach you to be afraid. It might actually stop you from learning how to feel joy. Okay, so what exactly do we mean by positive affect, or PA? Well, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's our ability to experience positive feelings, things like joy, gratitude, happiness, a sense of well-being. It's the whole range of good emotions that make life feel worth living. So to figure out if this idea was right, the researchers didn't just run one new experiment. No, they went big. They used what's called a meta-analysis, which means they pulled together data from decades of previous research to see the entire forest, not just the individual trees. How big are we talking? Well, they gathered the data from 115 separate studies, which altogether included data from over 305,000 people. That is just a massive sample size. And when you have that much data, your results have incredible statistical power. It means we can be really confident in what they found. Now, the specific technique they used is called meta-analytic structural equation modeling. It sounds complicated, I know, but the key thing to understand is that this method is super powerful. It doesn't just show that A is related to B. It lets you test a whole web of connections at once to see how A leads to B, which then leads to C. It's the perfect tool for figuring out if something like positive affect is really acting as that bridge we talked about. So when they ran their main model, they found 3 really clear pathways. First, path A, the more childhood adversity someone experienced, the lower their positive affect. That makes sense. Then, path B, the lower a person's positive affect, the more likely they were to experience psychopathology. And finally, path C just confirmed what we already knew. There's a direct link between adversity and psychopathology. The bottom line, all 3 of these connections were statistically significant and very strong. And here is the absolute key finding. When you put those paths together, the analysis confirmed what's called a significant indirect effect. What that means is that blunted positive affect is in fact the bridge. It's a proven mediator. It shows that a big part of how childhood adversity causes harm later in life is by first crushing a person's ability to feel good. But in science, the big picture is rarely the whole picture. The researchers knew that, and they saw that things were a bit more complicated under the surface. So they decided to dig a little deeper to see if certain factors made these connections stronger or weaker. The reason they did this is because of something called high heterogeneity.
Basically, when they looked at all 115 studies, the results were kind of all over the map. The technical number, an I-squared of over 94%, just confirmed that there was a ton of variation. This was a huge red flag that a simple, one-size-fits-all explanation just wasn't going to work. They needed to know why the results were so different.
And they found some really important patterns. First, the type of adversity matters a lot. It turns out that direct childhood maltreatment, we're talking about things like abuse and neglect, had a much stronger link to later mental health problems than other types of adversity, like growing up in a chaotic household. It seems like that direct maltreatment is especially toxic for a child's emotional development.
Another thing that mattered was how positive affect was measured in the first place. When studies used really broad measures like general well-being or happiness, the connection to psychopathology was stronger. But when they used very specific measures like gratitude, the link was weaker. It seems there's a bit of a trade-off here. The broad measures are better at predicting overall problems, while the specific ones might give us a more detailed psychological picture. And finally, the type of mental health problem made a big difference. The evidence was crystal clear that this blunting of positive emotion is a huge deal for what we call internalizing disorders, things like depression and anxiety. For externalizing disorders, think substance abuse or aggression, the link wasn't as clear. To be fair, there just wasn't as much data on those, so that's definitely an area where we need more research. Okay, so we've gone through a ton of data. What does this all mean in the real world? Let's talk about the implications, both for psychological theory and for how we actually help people. Theoretically, these findings are a huge boost for something called the broaden and build theory. The idea is this: if you grow up in a tough environment where good things rarely happen, it's actually an adaptation to not expect them, to sort of turn down your positive emotional system. But that adaptation has a massive downside. It robs you of all the good things that positive emotions do, like building resilience and helping you think more flexibly. You miss out on those upward spirals that help people thrive. And for clinicians on the front lines, the message is incredibly clear and practical. First, if you have a patient with a history of adversity, you should be actively looking for this blunted positive affect. And second, and this is so important, treatment needs to be about more than just trying to get rid of the bad stuff. We need therapies that actively build up the good stuff, strategies that are designed to enhance positive emotions, like helping people savor good moments or re-engage with rewarding activities. All right, we've covered a lot of ground here. So let's boil this entire massive study down to the 3 biggest take-home messages. Okay, here they are. Number 1. A lack of positive emotion is a confirmed bridge linking a tough childhood to adult mental illness. It's a key part of the puzzle. Number 2. This effect is especially powerful for people who experience direct maltreatment, and it's most strongly linked to problems like depression and anxiety. And number 3. To really help people heal from trauma, we can't just focus on reducing their pain. We absolutely have to help them rebuild their capacity for joy. And all of this really leads us to one final, huge question for the entire field of mental health. With such strong evidence, could it be that actively fostering positive emotions isn't just a nice add-on, but is actually the future of trauma therapy? Based on the results of this landmark study, the evidence is pointing to a resounding yes.